Dr. Dan Adams, he's working in Alice Springs, the Northern Territory, as part of their retrieval service. See you, Richard. I first got to meet him back in 2020 when I was emergency registrar working in the emergency department there, and then have subsequently come back and as a locum consultant just this past year. So without further ado, Dan, welcome and thanks very much for spending some time with us this morning. Nice to see you again.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Darren. And we did meet many years ago. It's amazing how time flies. Just pull up my slides. Am I sharing that screen? Oop, that's my second slide. Oh, goodness, I'm spilling the beans. My name's Dan Adams. I'm the Director of the Retrieval Service here at Alice Springs Hospital. We call ourselves the Central Australin Retrieval Service. And just to begin, I just want to acknowledge, pay my respects to the traditional Aranda and Gadigal custodians of the land here and over there in Sydney. As Darren says, I was asked to speak to you about the design of our service out here in Central Australia, which is actually a pretty unique request. I've never had that request before, so thank you very much for your interest. And thanks to Darren for facilitating this. Just a little bit about me. I'm a FACEM, an emergency physician with special interests in retrieval medicine, obviously, and also in paediatrics. I work here in the emergency department, as well as the majority of my time being in the retrieval service. And I've been living and working in Alice Springs for almost all of the last decade, although my more distant background is having trained in Adelaide. So I guess please just interrupt me if you've got any questions as we go. I think it's I don't have 45 minutes worth of me just rabbiting on, and I'd love to just field questions as they go. Ask questions as they arise. We're a really small team, but I think the team here provides some excellent care under pretty challenging conditions, and our service design is a little bit unique as well, and happy to field questions about it. So the first thing, I guess, to say is that we're a hospital-based retrieval service, and that there aren't that many of those that are our size anyway. And the department itself is nestled really right between ED and ICU and part of the critical care division of the hospital. My position is the head of department, and that's structurally really useful for us. And in fact, if I was to wave at you, if this was a webcam, that's my office right there, and MRACH sits just hidden out of view above the roof there. Out the front of the Alice Springs Hospital, and the emergency department is down here on the ground floor, and the ICU is just behind us on level 1. One of the things that we can do with that design is receive walk-ins, which we do from inpatient teams in the emergency department quite often. They'll just sort of wander over to the coordination office and do a face-to-face referral with us, which is lovely. And we also can and do often receive a referral at the patient bedside. They'll say, hey, can you just come down and see this patient, and we can chat about what the best thing to do with them is. So Alice Springs Hospital is our number 1 referrer, and when they refer to us, they place a request there for an in-hospital transfer to Adelaide about 85% of the time, Darwin about 10% of the time, or we will also do repatriations back to community, and occasionally we'll also travel to other locations, Melbourne or Perth or Townsville or whatever. But our main referring hospitals are Adelaide and Darwin. And I just snapped this photo of the office yesterday, and you can see the kind of the brains of the unit, which is these 4 desks here, and this is MRACH, the Medical Retrieval and Consultation Centre, and you can see Sandia, who's one of our nurse coordinators, and you've got 2 MRCs there. We have 2 MRCs in the office during a handover time, and there's a spare desk there, which does get a lot of use as well, and we'll sometimes bring one of our flight doctors in to do a consult or two if that's where the activity is, so we're a little bit flexible there. So the name of this office is MRACH. I think when people think about my service here in Central Australia, they think of us as MRACH rather than the Central Australin Retrieval Service. And rather than the Department of Retrieval Services or anything like that, we've been verbified. People talk about MRACing patients to Adelaide or MRACing patients into Alice Springs. And I guess it's a bit of a funny sounding word, MRAC, but it's a very literal name for what we do. And it does define, I think, something that's a bit different about our service. We're the medical retrieval and consultation centre. And so we do medical retrieval, but we also do quite a lot of consultations. So, within this role, we're both coordinating the retrievals that occur out of Alice Springs and providing a clinical consultation service. And that's mostly a nurse to doctor telehealth service. So remote area nurse to doctor consults. And we do kind of, depending on the activity, between 20 and 45 a day. So it's a little bit more like a virtual ED, I think, than most other coordination jobs would be. But then for inpatient teams, as I said, our main role is organising that transfer to a tertiary centre or back home. And I'd be very happy to talk about that and the evolution of MRAC, which is a pretty new thing. We've only really had a design like MRAC for the last 6-7 years. It was launched in 2018, and we had a very different style of service here, which I think is a little bit more like what a lot of the smaller sites would have up until 2018. So this is our catchment, and it is a large catchment. So the grey outline is really probably more the more usual catchment that we have, although we do not infrequently have to extend ourselves outside that catchment just because of the pressures on our adjacent services. So far as I can tell, this is the largest catchment for a single base in the country. It's got a 1,200 kilometre diameter. It's over 1 million square kilometres. Red is between the yellow and the red is what I call our outer rim, and that's at the red line is a 120-minute turboprop flight. The green flight is a 60-minute turboprop flight. Getting down to Adelaide by turboprop takes about 4 hours. It's about 10 kilometres closer to Adelaide than it is to Darwin, and it takes 2 hours and 20 minutes to go there in the jet. As you can see, we cross state borders, and quite a bit of our activity is in the APY lands in South Australia, but we also do cover the eastern sort of edge of Western Australia there. We'll rarely head into Queensland, and even more rarely into New South Wales. But one of the things that's, I think, quite unique about our catchment is just if you sort of look at the code of the ports there, the airports, is that there are very few refueling ports. So the green ones are the refueling ports. And we've really got Alice Springs in the middle, Tennant Creek up here, which is also the only hospital in our entire catchment, Yalara, which is where Uluru is, and really Coober Pedy is the next one down here. So that has a pretty big impact on our payload and our planning, all of the rest. If they're in grey there, then they're a paved airstrip, and so the red ones are dirt, which is the vast majority, the ones with stars are night rated. So we've got a majority of non-night rated airstrips. So there's also an awful lot of having to move a person over to the nearest night capable airstrip, and for the longest distance by road at night. We were looking at it the other day. It's a place called Bonya, which is sort of around about here, all the way down to Engawala, which is about here, and that takes about 3 hours by road at night. So has a big impact on us. And the other thing that's sort of interesting about it is that because there's only one hospital in our catchment, the whole thing is not funded by the territory. If you were to look at a similar sized catchment in pretty well any other jurisdiction, you would be looking at a site that had a lot of hospitals, and so the states and territories fund the responses to their for in-hospital transfers between hospitals, but the feds will fund remote retrievals, and so almost all of our work is remote retrievals, or a large proportion of our work is remote retrievals. So that's all federally funded work. But there you go, and that is certainly bigger than all of the UK and those 21 charities that we were just hearing about would well and truly fit inside our catchment. In fact, our catchment would fit all of Portugal, France, Germany combined, and Spain combined in there. So it's a big catchment, and it's the entire length of New Zealand, from top to bottom, to get from Alice Springs to Adelaide, or up to Darwin. So long distances, it's probably no surprise. And this is what we use to get around. The PC12 there at the top is our kind of daily runner. That's what we use for the vast majority of our remote primaries. It's a single engine turboprop, as you can see. They're pretty cool. I really enjoy working inside the PC12. It's got a lot of flexibility. It's got quite a wide rear opening, and can carry 2 stretcher loaded patients, and we'll often put an extra person, sometimes even 2 extra people in there. There are 3 seats in the back as well as 2 stretchers, depending on the acuity of the patients. And it's got quite a long range, as long as you've got the right amount of fuel in it to begin with. And then below is the PC24, which is used for our IHTs, primarily to Adelaide and Darwin, but with flexibility, and we'll use it for primaries if we can. And we also use it not infrequently to go up to Tennant Creek, where there's a hospital there as well. But we don't have a helicopter at all. Maybe one day we'll have a helicopter, and I think we probably could justify a helicopter in our catchment, but we have an ultra low density population here, with kind of 0.016 of a person per kilometre squared. And outside of the town of Alice Springs, which is not that large and pretty accessible by road, there's not a lot of people who are in that kind of inner ring that would benefit most from a helicopter. So it's not been a priority to have a helicopter historically. And just in terms of that low density there, the only places in the world that really compare with regards to that density of humanity is Nunavut and Greenland. So we're fairly uniquely sparsely populated. And just in terms of the arrangements, so we're a hospital-based retrieval service. We're doing the coordination, and RFDS are the team that provide the plane, the pilot, the flight nurse, quite a bit of the equipment there in the plane, and they'll also do the logistics around flight planning and what is and isn't possible, and what falls within CASA regulations and so on. So we're doing our clinical coordination. They're doing the logistics. Flight nurses will often fly on their own for lower complexity cases, and the CARS doctor will join them for those higher acuity missions. And don't need to tell you guys, but it's can get pretty squishy in there. We've got about a 30 centimetre gap between the stretcher and the seat, which is increasingly an issue for our increasingly bariatric population. If you've not been in a PC12 there's not a lot of room. The knees touch the stretcher there, and the doctor sits at the head of the bed. So there you go. And this is a pretty classic sort of community that we might be flying out to. We service a large number of Aboriginal communities in our catchment, and this one is Kintore, which is out west, sort of near the WA border. And we also service a number of mine sites. We service roadhouses and cattle stations as well, and then really just the one hospital up in Tennant Creek. And the population of these Indigenous communities is a few hundred people. The largest is Yuendamu, which you may have heard about, and is slightly over 1,000 people. But Kintore here has a couple of hundred people in it. They're often kind of strategically located near the only mountains in the area, which is a little bit of an issue for night flying. But they're not large places, and they're incredibly remote. And this is the sort of a classic clinic room. This one just happens to be in Freegon after a little bit of activity. So you can sort of tell that capacity is pretty limited, but the essentials are there. They're staffed by a remote area nurse, or a RAN, as everyone around here will call them. And there's very rarely a doctor anywhere nearby, so their medical support will come from us in Alice Springs. And if it's a really a GP type issue, then it will be, there's another service called ROC, or the Remote Outreach Consultation Centre, that operates just Monday to Friday and can provide nursing as a medical cover for the nurses out there for kind of standard scripts and things like that, which we won't do. But yeah, there's very rarely a doctor out there. It's one or two RANs, or a RAN and a support person out there with them. And single stretcher in the emergency room there. And an increasing number of them will have a camera on the roof that we can log into and control to see what's happening in the room, which is really handy. WHO essential medications, some bottle oxygen, as you can see, and some point of care blood tests, ECGs, urinalysis, things like that, fairly limited. There are 4 communities in our catchment that have X-ray facilities, but only one at the moment that actually has someone who's capable of using them. So we're pretty unlikely to be able to get an X-ray out of anywhere but Tennant Creek or Alice Springs Hospital. That's where we would be doing our resus in the field. So that's the service. That's the service design. And does anybody have any questions at this stage about the service?
I guess I'm interested in what's the overall population that you serve?
So the overall population, total number of people in our catchment is probably about 17,000 people outside of Alice Springs, because we don't tend to manage the people within Alice Springs. They're all a few minutes from the hospital. So yeah, we're dealing with about 17,000 people, which is 300 times less than just Greater Sydney.
Sorry, just an extension of that. How many people are in your team?
In my team, so our fully recruited team, we have basically, and I've got my roster up so you'll sort of see it, but basically right now we've got 5 registrars and 1 fellow, and we've got a total of sort of 6 FTEs spread over about double that, the number of consultants in the team. And we have 5 nurse coordinators. We have 1 admin officer called the aeromedical coordinator. That's the entire team. Any other questions?
The only other question I had is, when we interact with RFDS all over the place, and I know they've got the individual organisations in each state, but I was aware that they used to have physicians on board their aircraft in Central RFDS, and I'm just interested in why that changed, or what caused that to be a different system than the rest of the country.
Right. So RFDS SANT are the chapter that runs SA and the Northern Territory within that organisation, and it is a little bit of an unusual arrangement, but I suppose the way it's designed is much more like the sort of arrangement that a lot of other services would have, where they jump onto the platform that RFDS provides. And I guess when I think about that, MedStar's a good example of that, where if they need to do a longer range job, they will utilise an RFDS plane, and they'll go out with their team. I guess the difference is that we work with the flight nurse that RFDS provides, as opposed to bringing our own totally independent team out there. But that's how it's happened, and it's arisen this way because it wasn't that long ago that in Alice Springs, the medical support was one of the doctors sitting in the emergency department, which is what you'll still see in some other places. So it was an emergency physician on shift in ED, picking up the lower acuity or easier to hand over type patients for the day, overseeing registrars, that sort of thing. And then if they got activated, then they would go flying. And then the activity increased to the point that that really was a dangerous design, and we moved over to one where we took over the coordination, which used to be done by the rural generalists out here, and then they would call the emergency physician for advice if there was a acute care patient, which was multiple times every single day, and then it all became a little bit of a dog's breakfast, actually, trying to figure out who's got clinical governance here. Is it the flight doctor who's now incommunicado on the plane on the way out there? Is it the emergency physician who's stuck in resus with a patient that's just come in the door? Or is it the rural generalist who is not really all that well suited to managing this and answering the questions that the remote area nurse has for them right now? So we moved to a system like the one that we have, where we've always got a retrieval consultant available on the phone, and it's really clear who has clinical governance over this patient for the duration of the mission, and yet it's stayed all in-house within NT Health and in specific within Alice Springs Hospital. And I wouldn't have it any other way. I think it's a really, really great system compared to any of the alternatives I can think of.
Excellent, thank you.
My absolute pleasure. So, moving on. What do we do? And we're a small team, as I just said, much smaller than you guys. And I know you guys do absolutely outstanding education. But I am really proud of the educational experiences that we can offer here for the registrars, and actually not just the registrars, but all of the other players in the pre-hospital space in Central Australia. There are a few things that are really unique about operating in Central Australia in terms of case mix and the way in which we need to manage cases. But the first thing is our registrar orientation, and I guess things are simplified significantly by the absence of the need for rotary training. But we do 2 weeks of dedicated orientation, including almost everybody being new to town. So that's got to include hospital induction and NT Health induction and all of our clinical systems and things like that. The hangar, the ambulance base and the ambulances in general, and the plane orientation. We do a 3-day-long multidisciplinary course that has really evolved from what was just the registrar clinical orientation. We call it CART, the Central Australin Retrieval Training course, and that runs in February and in August, in the first week of our intake. So basically, registrar term 1 and registrar term 3 at the beginning of those. And we also do an extrication day following that. We call it CART X. And we extend that training, as I said, to all of those healthcare professionals out there that we interface with. So, CART will have our 6 registrars, but it will also have hospital nurses. A couple of remote area nurses will come in for it. We have paramedics from St John Ambulance, who are the ambulance service here. Remote GPs will come in. Flight nurses will come in. There are a couple of mines have mine paramedics, and they'll come in as well. And we all get together, and it's actually just really fantastic. We can split them all up into teams, and we can have multidisciplinary sim running with exactly the sorts of flash teams that we're forced to deal with in the real world. And this is just a photo of me looking as serious as you'll ever find me looking, watching a sim unfold with an IO and some bagging there. And then, this is CART X sim. So this is we do a mass casualty incident, a site I'm not willing to divulge, just out of town here. And this is with NTES, or the sort of SES equivalent, St John's, and one of our retrieval doctors sitting there at the head of the patient out in the dirt, which is the sort of thing that we've got to do. So that's our CART X day. And then we also have 3 hours of dedicated education time every Wednesday, and it's also multi-agency. So RFDS and St John's will all attend regularly, and it consists of a bit of an informal case debriefing, although there's quite a good opportunity to do that on a day-to-day basis as well, because of the fact that our flight doctors are based here at the hospital, literally across the hall from the specialists who are doing coordination. But we will we'll run a slightly larger informal case debriefing session on a Wednesday morning, and then we'll have sims and workshops. And this is a sim that we did down the road at the St John's base, and you can see there an RFDS flight nurse, one of our retrieval doctors, and a couple of paramedics there. And in fact, this was a kind of an interesting sim that I ran around, based around the idea of an MVA down south of us at a fairly notorious black spot, which is just 300 kilometres from the nearest stretcher, but still on the highway. It's the sort of place where, you know, only we had a helicopter. And then the other thing I just wanted to point out is that, you know, we don't have our own neonatal retrieval service, and 1 to 2% of our work is remote primary neonatal retrievals, and it's often in the context of a term or prem, sometimes quite prem delivery. So here in Central Australia, there's this concept of sit down, which really is supposed to happen from about 38 weeks gestation. And people usually do come in, these women do generally come into town, but then it's not uncommon at all for them to get quite homesick. And it does mean that they'll head back out to community after a few days, missing their families, missing their land, and then they'll go into labour and we'll have to deal with a neonate. And so this is us doing a neonatal upskilling with the Flinders neonatologists who come up and visit. It's a little bit of a unique thing about the Central Australin Retrieval Services, you know, whereas I think most other retrieval services would very much split off this portion of work to a different group of clinicians. Any questions about the training?
And Chris, sounds like you do an amazing job with a big group of people that would obviously enjoy coming together twice a year.
Yeah, it is. It's a lovely course, and we are quite proud of the course. I think, you know, one of the things that makes it all work is that, and it's small town vibes. Everybody gets on well, and we're able to have a really active and functional relationship with these other agencies that we have to work with, be that in the hospital, primary healthcare, and primary healthcare consists of probably majority of the clinics still are NTG run clinics, so NT health clinics, but there are a number of ARCHOs as well in the space, Aboriginal community controlled health organisations that run the clinics in some of the communities, and then you've got St John's as well and RFDS, so there are a lot of players in the space. Well, a little bit about case mix, and this is just the doctor jobs, and these are the numbers from the last month that we had. And so, looking at the associateship definitions, which is what we use, we've got about a fifth of our work falls into the crit care category. We did 70 retrievals in May with doctors on board. Another 52% of those were in that high dependency category, and then 25% were in the low dependency category. And we've done quite a bit of work on trying to make sure that our doctor utilization rate is right. You know, you don't want to be sending a plane out into an incredibly isolated location and then wishing you had a doctor on board very often. But you also don't want to be fatiguing doctors to do quite long missions when their skill mix isn't required. So getting that balance has required a little bit of work and titration. It's a little bit like, you know, your positive rate for CTPAs. It needs to be neither too high nor too low. And then in terms of the sorts of patients we pick up, and I did think that this might be of interest to you guys, that relatively few of our jobs are trauma. And we certainly do see trauma, you know, maybe a fifth of the work that we do. But it's a specific sort of trauma, and it's the sort of trauma that has self-selected for at least a period of survival. You know, we're very rarely able to get to someone within an hour of their traumatic incident. And in fact, it's often many hours before they come to attention. So they tend to be self-selected for survival, which isn't to say that they aren't on death's door by the time we get there, but their trend has been a little bit slower than the sort of patient that you guys are able to get to in the city. But the majority of our jobs are medical jobs. It's around about half of the pickups are for medical reasons of one sort or another. Quite a bit of our work is cardiac, and that's not just ischemia, that's also valvular disease, which is pretty prevalent, incredibly common here in Central Australia. And we have a lot of sepsis, and it tends to be young person sepsis, and not always particularly crumbly person sepsis. This is a young person who's a late presentation with an infection, who will turn around if you get the right antibiotics on board and they get a couple of days of MRACH. So that's kind of another interesting thing about Central Australia, is that the turnaround in ICU is really rapid. People come in really sick and then get better pretty fast if the correct treatment is instituted. So it's really satisfying to be able to treat people who improve like that, as opposed to these really long stays in a lot of ICUs. So about 17% of our work is mental health, and that's almost all acute psychosis or attempted suicide, and almost all of the attempted suicide is by hanging or ligatures. And 10% of our work is obstetric, of which 1% becomes neonate. And the average age of our patients is pretty young. I haven't got the breakdown of the patients that we've retrieved over any particular given period of time, but it's really rare to see patients over the age of 80 here in Central Australia. There's just not very many people who live that long. So the classic patient that we're picking up is in there somewhere between their 20s and 40s. And so these are patients with multi-morbid disease. They've got diabetes, they've got ischemic heart disease. So they've got ischemic heart disease, hypertension, peripheral vascular disease. A large number of these patients, and I didn't separate it out, are renal dialysis patients. And there's a lot of dialysis performed on country, but there's also quite a few people who will miss their dialysis, and they'll have sort of travelled somewhere for sorry business, which is essentially funeral business. And then if they haven't arranged to have a chair or haven't arranged to have dialysis on the day before they leave, then they might arrive in the clinic a week later having missed dialysis sort of 3 or 4 times and looking pretty fluid overloaded. And then, as I said, 15% of our work is pediatric. About 1 to 2%, depending on the month, ends up being a neonate, either a primary or perhaps increasingly this year, we've been moving more neonates out of town as well, because it's a big deal for someone to come from interstate to come and collect these babies, and everybody's pretty pressed. Although historically, MedStar kids from Adelaide would come up here, and they still do. We are not always able to rely on them. 75% of our work is that modified primary work, where there's been some work up by our healthcare professional in a community, and that's a non-primary, non-crit care remote area nurse in the vast majority of cases. I'd say 1 in 10 of them, maybe 1 in 20 of them, there's a GP that happens to be in community or a specialist doing outreach, or something like that. About 5% of our work is a true primary, where we're out at a cattle station where there's been only lay people present until we arrive. And about 20% of our work is hospital transfer work, either from Tennant Creek to Alice Springs or from Alice Springs to Adelaide, as I said before. But another thing that's pretty unique about our service, and defines us in so many ways, is that our average mission time is really long. From activation to being clear of the case and having handed them over is around about 5 hours. And that's not because we're sitting on scene all day. It's because it just takes forever to get out there and to get back and to hand over the patient and to finish up your documentation and reset. So our average scene time is around about 30 minutes. And again, that reflects the scene times that we have reflect the patient population and the issues that we have. So we're in a place of relative safety. And before we jump out of the frying pan and into the fire, it's sensible for us as a team to stabilise a medically unwell patient where actually definitive care is present at scene in many instances. If someone has sepsis and you've given them the broad spectrum antibiotics and they need inotropic support, well, we should be staying in plane to manage that person, as opposed to a trauma patient where we've got to get them in to figure out where their source of bleeding is, and they need surgical involvement, which is a relatively small portion of our work, as I said. And then the final, slightly funny thing that we find ourselves doing and really enjoy doing is event work. So we'll send a doctor and a nurse from our team along to multiple local events every year. And there are quite a few rodeos around. In fact, the Brunette Downs Rodeo is on right now, but the Aileron Rodeo, Harts Range Rodeo, there are a number of these events out there which have always got a few people who take a tumble, and I'm still not sure why it's possible for a 10-year-old to get on a bull, but it's a thing. And then we have the Wide Open Space Music Festival here, which is pretty much the only music festival that is in our catchment, but brings with it a unique toxicological mix. There are a number of extreme endurance events that occur here in Central Australia, and probably the West Max Monsters, the one that looms large, where quite a few people will run the entire 230-kilometre length of the Larapinta Trail without a break, which still just blows my mind that anyone can do that. And then the final one is the Finke Desert Race, which you may have heard of. It's a fairly large motorbike race where the competitors travel day one from Alice Springs out to Finke, or Aputula Community, which is 100 kilometres south of here, along the old Garn railway line, and the track that's been made there. And then on day two, they'll come back again as fast as they can. And we sent 3 of our doctors to be embedded with St John's, or 2 of them were embedded with St John's along the track, and one of them was actually at the clinic at Finke at the other end with one of our nurses as well. And the Finke Desert Race is a pretty interesting thing for us. It's a planned mass casualty event, and the whole hospital and the whole health service really has to do a lot of planning to be able to manage the amount of activity we get from it. So we do things like cancelling elective surgeries, we'll clear out the hospital, we'll make sure that we don't have specialists in town that aren't going to be helpful for this event for that week. We put on plaster techs over the weekend, and we put on extra staff. As I said, ED puts on extra staff, theatres got extra staff. So it's actually a really great way for us to be prepared for a major incident, because we do it every single year, which is something that I think a lot of other places don't actually do. Any question about the case mix?
I think no questions from the room. Anything online? No, just to say, I mean, an amazing job you guys do in a very beautiful part of the world, but really challenging in many ways. So,
thank you. Thanks. Yeah, I love living here. Maybe my last slide. I just thought I'd throw up our shift structure. This is just for the retrieval doctors, really, but it just shows the alignment between what RFDS have on offer with their nurse and pilot combo, and what we do as doctors. So just looking at the RFDS shifts, they've got a total of 6 crews. One of them's the jet crew, and as I said, that's the team that'll do kind of 95% of our in-hospital transfers. And let me tell you, it's amazing having a jet. It wasn't that long ago at all that we turbopropped people everywhere, and it was tight. 4 hours of flying time to get to Adelaide or Darwin meant that any delay, if we arrived in ICU and the patient still needed a couple of things done, for instance, they hadn't had their high flow weaned, or they didn't have an art line in yet, or something like that, then we sometimes just had to defer the job because the pilot couldn't get there and back in the time that we had. And it was also an increasing issue with access to hospitals, in that we would land in Adelaide and we'd sometimes have rather a long wait to get to the RA or whichever hospital we had referred the patient to. And that also sometimes meant that the doctor would just have to stay in Adelaide overnight, which has a fairly catastrophic impact on our roster and capability, given that that's a third of our medical support for the following day. And then they have to take a commercial plane back up while the nurse and the pilot flew home in the time that the pilot had available. So the jet means that we've just got a little bit more leeway to do what needs to be done and still get everybody home for dinner. Day two's got that longer crew, and then we've got the afternoon team, which kind of bridges between the morning cruise and the night cruise. It's a lovely luxury now, in my opinion, to have a second night crew. It was always very nerve-wracking to have just the one night plane, and that's the way things were here for decades. And so it meant that if you did use that night plane for anything, then the whole rest of Central Australia, which is a very large and isolated place, was really without any capability until that crew was available again. And the big thing that would happen is that we might get an urgent IHT. You know, someone comes in with a quarter equina, they've got to get down to Adelaide for urgent neurosurgery, and so our night crew would head off down to Adelaide, and they'd be completely out of Central Australia for the entirety of their shift. So it was pretty nerve-wracking then having to sit in MRAC and manage patients, no matter where they were, no matter what was wrong with them, just with the limited support that was available from RANs, which in many instances were a couple of hours drive away from the patient. So that's that, and I guess there's one jet and two turboprops in town. So, you know, if we send day one and day two out, then we may not actually have a plane available for the afternoon team. They'll have to wait for the turnaround of one of the planes. And then aligned to that, for our doctors, we've got a 10-hour shift structure, which works well for us, and we've played around with various options. So we have one person on shift, from 7 till 5, and with a little bit of pre-shift on call, just in case it's required at 6 o'clock. We have a second person who stays on standby, sort of on call, and that may be off-site, and on weekends that's certainly always the case. It may be someone like myself, and I do quite a few of these on-calls. I can get paperwork done, and I have a little off chance of flying, which is quite nice. And we call in our on-call person, maybe 1 in 10 days. So it's not used that often. And it's been fantastic because it means that when you're on shift, your odds of flying are quite good. And nobody likes to sit around and twiddle their thumbs on a flight shift. So once upon a time, we did have two actual dedicated shifts there, and it just was not necessary. Afternoon doctor, probably the single most likely doctor to be activated. So there's a lot of activity in the afternoon. It feels like everybody gets up at the crack of noon in Central Australia, particularly in summer. So we start getting a whole bunch of calls into MRAC from 11, 12, and so it's that afternoon team that cops it. And then we've got a night doctor. And one of the interesting things about the night doctor here is I haven't put on here the MRC shifts. We've also got an MRC shift that spans the morning, and an MRC shift which is a bit of a disco shift, so 4 p.m. till 2 a.m. But between 2 a.m. and 7 a.m. when the morning consultant comes back in, our night doctor will cover the phones. So unless they're flying, they're in the MRAC office, and they'll take that initial call and provide that initial support to the remote area nurse in most instances. But whoever it is, they'll take the in-hospital transfer requests from the team overnight in the hospital. We can go and see the patient and make sure that they're all ready in the morning when the jet crew comes online. And if they need to go flying, then they will call the MRC, who's on the night shift, on the evening shift, task themselves, head out the door, and then the MRC PM will, depending on how unwell the patient is, either come in and sit in the office and manage the patient with the remote area nurse, or manage it remotely with our nurse coordinator there, kind of facilitating calls. So the night doctor gets called Ned as the night everything doctor. But it's actually a really cool way to give our registrars a bit of a taste of sitting in the MRAC office. And it forces us to make sure that they can do it, which sometimes means that when 6 clinics all call us in a 15-minute period at midday at the crack of noon, as I said, then we can get one of our registrars to come in and take 1 or 2 of those consults as well, supported by us during the day. It's quite a neat little system, which I don't think very many other teams, if any other teams around the country, are doing. Any questions about the shift structure?
No questions at the moment. I think the teams are happy they don't have to get sent on 6 or 8 hour missions. So.
It's tiring. It's tiring. There's nothing worse than going out, as I said, to pop a drip in or do not much. So we really try to make sure that we need the doctor. But that's got to be balanced against the fact that there's also nothing worse than having a team out there 20 minutes away from the community that needs support. Say, woman goes into labour, and then having a plane, but no doctor or not the right equipment on board. So and there's a whole conversation to be had about how, unfortunately, our standard kit has to be pretty inclusive so that you don't end up with the right crew but not the right equipment many hours away from someone if you ever need to be diverted. And just, the last thing I wanted to say is about Alice Springs. And don't tell anybody, but Alice Springs is all right. It's actually a fantastic place to live. And I really love the overall culture of Alice Springs. It cops a really bum rap in the national media. And it's just undeserved, frankly. And I'm not quite sure why we get dumped on the way we do, but it's really a fantastic place to live. I love the culture of this place. It's equal parts artsy and classic outback Australian. There's a huge impact of Aboriginal culture here. There's always lots of excited tourists, although slightly fewer now that everybody thinks they're going to get stabbed on entry. It's a town that's really just energetic and alive. And also it's a town where the healthcare professionals around here are just awesome, and who do what needs to be done. They're yes sayers, not no sayers. The remote clinicians out in Central Australia do amazing work and just kind of get on with the job no matter what it is. And I will say that quite a number of them are carrying trauma from having been just thrown into the deep end. But they do just keep doing it, and they're incredible people. And I know not a lot of people could do that work. So well done to them. And then the other thing that I don't think you get to say as an emergency physician very often is that the inpatient teams here and the ED work together incredibly well in a rarely seen example of collaboration. And for those who work in the pre-hospital space, the other thing that's absolutely amazing about Alice Springs is that there is no ramping ever in Alice Springs. It just doesn't happen. There's always the ability to offload into the emergency department, and there's almost always a spot to put that person. So our waiting room isn't filled up with people all night long, and our resus bays aren't constantly full, and our ICU often has a bed. So it's it's just a really amazing place to work, and with a lot of really unwell patients as well. I kind of get it all. So sucked into you guys. But any questions now in the last 5 minutes about anything at all?
Hi, Dan. I'm Scott. I had a question about, you've got an enormous catchment area, and I presume quite a lot of heterogeneity across that area in terms of culture and language. How do you navigate that as an organisation? Do you have sort of a group of people that are able to liaise with different communities and maintain a positive relationship and a functional relationship from a language and culture perspective?
Good question. And so you're talking specifically about the number of Indigenous nations that are sitting within our catchment, I guess.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, so we've got a core of Aboriginal liaison officers that works here in the hospital, and it's there's a little bit of movement there, but basically it's important that we can cover each of the language groups that are present. I haven't popped up a photo of it, but you just need to go out and have a look at this. There's 8 different language groups within our catchment, and we will often engage them. A great example just recently was we had a young man who had an embolic stroke, and actually it's just incredible how young people have strokes here in Central Australia, and underlying valvular disease, large embolic stroke. Needed to go down to Adelaide for urgent clot retrieval, and was pretty confused about what was going on, which was maybe a function of the stroke, but also the language barrier and providing culturally safe care to that man was really, really challenging. And so our ALOs came in, and they came in after hours and chatted with him. We also will really very often bring in an escort. So the odds of someone coming in just to be a cultural broker for a person is relatively high if their language is not there to communicate in the language that we need to communicate in, which is English, then we'll have someone else come along who can help out. And that happened in that case as well. But that's it. And then, as I said, there's an increasing number of Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations out there. Congress is one that you may have heard of. The Central Australian Aboriginal Congress is probably the largest ARCHO in the country. They manage a number of the community clinics out there now, and have a large presence in town as well. And so these are organisations with, Aboriginal board that makes decisions on where their health dollar is spent, and that improves the access to what patients actually need and want, as opposed to what is kind of dictated to them. Does that answer your question? Is there anything else there that I needed to say? I would love to have more involvement with ALOs, and it'd be amazing to be able to bring them out with us to do this work. But it's also true that it's hard to find people who are really good at doing the cultural bridging that is necessary to be in two worlds. And it's also true that these individual nations are so small that the odds of this particular patient knowing personally the ALO and therefore getting a little bit hairy and maybe dodgy around that being the right person to be there as an independent assistant is relatively high.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Dan. That's a really unique challenge. Thanks.
Can't see anything. I mean, I can see the podium, but I have no idea what's going on in the room.
Hi, Dan. That was a phenomenal talk. I had a question around blood. I think I'm right in saying that you guys carry bloods, and I just wondered if you could expand a little bit around. You obviously cover the largest area in Australia nearly, and given you may have a patient who is bleeding either from a medical or traumatic cause miles away from definitive care, how you manage that at MRACH as an organisation.
Cool. Yeah, no, happy to answer that question. And we do carry blood, so we'll place our blood in credo boxes, which is probably pretty standard. We have two pre-packed credo boxes just below us, sitting in the emergency department, in the blood room in the emergency department, which is kind of between us and the door, so easy to grab on the way out. We use a Belmont Buddy Light fluid warmer. RPS do also have their own fluid warmer, but we have the Buddy Light, and we will not infrequently throw 2 units from one box into the other box, so we've got 4 units of blood. We can bring cryo out, and we can have that thawed for us, but sometimes there's a little bit of a delay to getting out the door and out to the airport, just to have it ready to go and packaged. And shortly we'll have fibrinogen concentrate here in Central Australia as well as an option. But yeah, we won't bring platelets. There's 1 bag of platelets here in Alice Springs. So in fact, even in the hospital, the massive transfusion protocol has to reflect the single bag of platelets that we have, and we need to be quite judicious with its use. We sometimes get a bit lucky, and it's the changeover day for the platelets, and we've got 2 bags of platelets. But generally, we've only got 1 bag of platelets. But we'll pack 4 units of blood at a maximum into a single credo box and bring that out with us with a fluid warmer. Before we get there, we do often have to give crystalloid in order to maintain blood pressure. And it does open up, a really interesting challenge around, do we use pressors in trauma? Do we just use crystalloid? How much, what is the right blood pressure to tolerate here? And it's a situation that we don't all have to deal with very often when we're working much closer to crit care. So we will generally give a bit of crystalloid bolus, and then if we need to, we might use some peripheral adrenaline. Also keeping in mind that you've got 1, maybe 2 nurses out there with a really unwell patient and lots of other competing priorities. So you kind of got to come up with something that they can practically do and is a little bit set and forget, and they can move on to the next task while keeping the person alive for us to get there. I think that answers the question.
Yeah, that's brilliant. No, thanks very much, Dan.
Any other questions? We're right on 10:15. I think
that's all
did I
from
have
the room.
45 minutes?
Is there
We've
anything-
already run long.
That's all right. Nothing else online there, Kim? No. Thanks very much, Dan. I really appreciate you taking the time. I'll certainly vouch for you that Alice Springs is an awesome place to work and live, and really interesting patient population as well, different from anywhere else that I've ever worked. So thanks very much.